Welcome everyone, and we say good morning, good evening, good night to everyone, depending on which time zone that you live in, because as we know, there are always people in this meeting from all over the world. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 14 years, and this is our 132nd edition of our Zoom public meeting. And we wish to sincerely thank all those who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 131 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 2 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks, we have featured over 444 presenters from all parts of the world, speaking on 131 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, which is a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Dabidine. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking that you kindly give us your suggestions as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahabir for further details. So ladies and gentlemen, our moderator this evening or tonight is Shalama Mohammed, the co-director of this Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA, and she's a strong advocate for health and wellness practices based on traditional and alternative healing. So Shalma, welcome. Please take over from here.
Hi everyone. Assalamu alaikum, namaste, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Today we are having some internet difficulties, and unfortunately I am not functioning as well as I should have. But I appreciate the fact that all of you all are here with us, and I just want to remind everyone, all our speakers in particular, please do not unmute anyone, do not allow anyone to share your screens, because we want to avoid any trolling, okay? At this point in time, I'm going to revert to Shakira, and Shakira, I'll ask you to please do the introduction. Thank you. You'll have to unmute.
All right. So we know that most people would be watching the TV, the live FIFA Football World Cup matches in Qatar that will be played until December 18th. And this public meeting today or tonight will take the usual form of a panel presentation, followed by questions and answers. To avoid the trolls invading our program, our IT manager, Ravin, has muted everyone. Speakers are advised not to admit anyone, not to unmute anyone, and not to allow anyone to share their screens. This meeting should not exceed 2 hours. So our topic today or tonight is entitled Mixed Race Dougla Identity in the Indian Diaspora, Creolisation, Indianisation, or both. So despite rivalries and tensions between Indians and Africans in the Caribbean and elsewhere, the number of interracial unions and Douglas, or the children of such unions, continues to increase. There are some questions which we hope to address. What is the attitude of this mixed race group to the two major competing groups in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname? What is the attitude of these two groups towards Douglas? Is being a Dougla a disadvantage or a privilege? Do Douglas feel that they are more national in their post-colonial times? What cultural traditions and ideologies do Douglas follow? With whom do we socialize? How do we align culturally? Who are their heroes? Who do they marry? How do they vote in the race-based party politics of these societies? These are some of the questions to be addressed in this Zoom public meeting. But before we hear from our distinguished panel of speakers, let us hear a calypso by the mighty Dougla. So, Ravin, will you play the song for us?
let us suppose they pass a law, they don't want people living here anymore. Just suppose they pass a law, they don't want people living here anymore. Everybody got to find their country according to your race originally. What a confusion I would cause in the place. They might have to shoot me in space, because they're sending Indians to India, and the Negroes back to Africa. Can somebody please just tell me where they're sending for me? I am neither one nor the other, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If they're serious about sending back people for true, they got to split me in two. From the time of small and confusion, I couldn't play with no other little children. If I go by the Negro children to play, they say, you little foolie, now run away. I go by the Indian children next door, they say, no weary and what you come here for? I always by myself like a little monkey, not one single child wouldn't play with me. So if they're sending Indians to India, and the Negroes back to Africa, can somebody please just tell me where they're sending for me? I am neither one nor the other, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If they're serious about sending back people for true, they're bound to split me in two. Hear what happened to me recently. I'm going down Jogi Road walking peacefully. Some Indians and Negroes rioting. For me didn't know not a single thing. But as I enter in holding trace, an Indian man cocked me straight in my face. I ran by the Negroes to get rescue. Look a coolie and them start beating me too. So if they're sending Indians to India, and the Negroes back to Africa, can somebody please just tell me where they're sending for me? I am neither one nor the other, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If they're serious about sending back people for true, they're bound to split me in two. Some fellas having a race discussion, I jump in to give my opinion. A young fella watched me in my face. He say, you shut your mouth, you ain't got no race. What he said to me was a real insult, but it's not I to blame, it's my father's fault. When he say I have no race, he didn't talking true. Instead of having one race, you know I got two. So if they're sending Indians to India, and the Negroes back to Africa, can somebody please just tell me where they're sending for me? I am neither one nor the other, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If they're serious about sending back people for true, you're bound to split me in two.
Okay, so it looks like Shakira is muted now and I'm here. There shall be no splitting of people in two today. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear why this is absolutely not necessary. That calypso was composed 61 years ago in 1961, and as far as we know, nobody has been split in two, and we like to keep it that way. So ladies and gentlemen, now for our panel of distinguished speakers, and we will begin with Nadine Mirage Drummond of Jamaica. She's now living in Switzerland. She's a former CNN and Al Jazeera TV news producer and an award-winning journalist and filmmaker who has visited more than 30 countries. Welcome, Nadine. You can speak for 15 minutes. Please unmute.
I've unmuted. Thank you, everybody, for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And so I don't have much time, so I won't waste it with my introduction. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, I can't see any of you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, quite clearly, and we're hearing you clearly as well.
Perfect. So my name is Nadine Mirage Drummond. I am a proud Indian African Caribbean from Jamaica. Now, Indians in Jamaica make up the 3rd largest ethnic group. There are not as many of us as in Guyana or Trinidad or Suriname, but we are in strongholds within the country. In Jamaica, 36,000 Indians between 1845 and 1917 were deposited, and I say deposited on the island because not everybody came by choice, to work in the sugar plantations at the end of the enslavement of Africans. And I am a descendant of those indentured workers, or then were called servants. I am the first person in my family after a 130-year sojourn in Jamaica to return to India. And my first visit, I've been to India 4 times now. My first visit was in 2016, and I stayed a month and toured the country. And like many of us on this call, whether we're Indian or African, we don't know where we come from in India. We just know that we come from a particular area, perhaps because of a dialect or words or languages that were spoken, and fractions of those languages were passed down. And this was my visit to Agra when I went to see the Taj Mahal, which was a huge spiritual and emotional experience. And going to India was the first time I felt like the pieces of me fit together, because what I learned about Indian culture was from the root, because I traveled from the north to the south. And when I got to the south, I saw people that looked like me, and I didn't feel like a stranger. And when people were asking me who I was and what I was doing there and where I was from and why I looked the way I looked, when I'd explained to them the outpouring of love and acceptance I'd never experienced anywhere else. I'm also the first person in my family on my mother's side, which is my Indian side, to go to university. I'm also the first person in my family to have 2 degrees, and that's quite significant because my family had come to Jamaica to work on the plantations. And you may or may not know that during that period, the Indian laborers were paid less than the African laborers. And even now within Jamaica, it's very difficult for the indigenous Indians, or the Indians that had been coming from 1845, to change their financial circumstances without going abroad, because a foundation for deliverance and acceptance was never really paved for them or paved for us. And so within my family, it's a huge deal. And this was my graduation from the University of Miami, and my mum had traveled from England, and it was a big deal. And also all of my family, there are 3 pockets of us now. We're in London, we're in Canada, and we're in Miami and New York en masse. And so all of my Florida family had come to that graduation as well. And this is really important in terms of my experience within the Indian diaspora, because there were key Indians that helped me get to where I am. But it wasn't without challenge. And part of that challenge is what the mighty Dougla spoke about, which was being split in 2. And throughout my life, I have experienced and still continue to experience extreme anti-Black and anti-Indian abuse, prejudice, racism, whatever you want to call it. So this is me when I was 5. This was my first year in school. And when my mum dropped me off, a little Black boy came to tap me on my shoulder and said, "Your mum's a Paki." Now in England, a Paki was a racist term similar to the N-word, or calling somebody a nigger, which was used to abuse Indian people, or people from India, whether they were Pakistani or Bangladeshi or whatever. And I didn't understand what that word meant because I'd never heard it before. But I knew it was a bad word, and I knew he thought my mum was something bad. And I'd never thought of my mum as Indian or anything. I knew she wasn't like my dad, but I just didn't think in that way. And when I'd gone back and I'd said to my mum, "Mummy, what is a Paki?" She said, "Who called you that?" I said, "They didn't call me it, they called you it." And she said, who said that?" and I had to point out the boy, and there was an altercation with the mother and all kinds of things. But that didn't change. That was my first experience. And then when I was this age, this is my sister Hilary. When I was this age, I was 8 going on 9. No, I wasn't. I was 7 going on 8. And by that time, I could sit on my hair. And during this period, my mom had pierced her nose and used to wear a bindi. And when my mom used to drop me off at school, the kids used to call me a black Paki, a Paki, and a nigger Indian. So the Indian children, the unmixed children from the continent used to call me a nigger Indian, and the black kids used to call me a black Paki. And they also used to jock me in the middle of my forehead where my mum's bindi would be and pull my hair. And they used to pull my hair so much that the back was bloody and swollen and bruised by all of the pulling. And I had an Indian Trinidadian teacher. She wasn't my teacher. She taught a different class. And one day she came and said to me, "Oh, Nadine, come to my classroom, come to my classroom." And she had brought some oil. And that oil, she clearly made at home, because in those days in England, there was no oil. She'd made this oil at home. And she used to massage my scalp and replait my braid to take the pressure off of the roots where they used to pull my hair. And she waited at the gate for my mum one day, and she said, this can't work. She has to move schools. She has to leave schools. I will help you. And by that time, the abuse was so bad that my elder brother had come to the school and had beaten up all of the boys that used to pull my hair. And then I was excluded. But by that time, Mrs. Edwards had helped me find another school in an area which was a lot nicer, and the kids were a lot more civilized. That doesn't mean that my classroom is any less mixed. They were just kinder children. But I'd been traumatized from my early experiences. Now, my sister didn't have the same kind of anti-Indian, anti-mixed experiences, but she looks far more Black or African than I do. But within our family, her experiences were much harder than mine. When we were children in Jamaica, my mom's family are what we call white Indians. They're very light-skinned. And when other Indians used to come by, because we come from an Indian community within a place called St. Mary in Jamaica, my sister and my cousin, I had another full Indian cousin, Shelly-Ann, but she was dark. They used to lock Shelly-Ann and my sister Hilary in the cupboard to hide that my sister was far more African looking than anybody anticipated, and that Shelley was darker than anybody had anticipated. And it wasn't until over COVID, my sister and I were talking about these experiences, that I said, when all the people used to come and we used to have to serve sweets and tea and everything and shy, and I said, "Where were you?" She said, "They used to lock us in the cupboard." I didn't even know that was a thing. And so the abuses that we experienced were based on our phenotype, were based on how we looked, but they also impacted us differently in different situations. And I put this picture here, which is of me and my youngest brother, Winston, because I like it. And I remember feeling extremely beautiful and extremely happy that day, because that was the first time anybody had ever engaged me outside of my immediate family to do anything. So I remember being really proud. And then I'll talk about my brother a bit later. Part of the challenge of these experiences, when you experience this virulent anti-Blackness and anti-Indianness, is rooted in our colonial histories. And part of my healing has been understanding the root of that and being able to forgive people for their ignorance. So this child, who's of, I would say, 100% Indian and Indian ethnicity, was referred to as a Hindu coolie. The mixed child, a coolie Sambo, which I guess would have been what I was or am. And then you have a Sambo. And I think what's interesting about this picture, apart from how horrendous the classifications are, is that the Hindu coolie is an actual name. It's not just a classification, because there are no quote marks. Whereas a Sambo is not a classification, it's a description of a particular type of person. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a fact. but the fact that an Indian person was identified by their religion. So I'd imagine they had Muslim coolies as well. And their job robbed them of their, not just their humanity, but their individuality, which was quite frightening. And I think often, or at least in my experience within my own family and my own Indian community, is that theft of identity and home and language and religion and the designation at the bottom of the pile is what in some way informs that desire to cling on to and hold on to what is a version of being Indian and excluding everything outside of it. But as I said earlier, I'd experienced a lot of diaspora support throughout my education, and there were key Indian diaspora people that helped me get to where I am. I spoke about Mrs. Edwards. She protected me and she took care of me. She also used to let me eat lunch in her classroom, and she used to bring food from home so that I could eat with her. And this happened for months. So she could protect me from the bullies and give my parents an opportunity to figure out what to do next and where to put me. The school that I moved to, there was an Indian Malaysian teacher called Mr. Chand. And once Mr. Chand realized that I was an Indian and African mix, he had decided that I needed to know far more about India. So you can't do these things in England anymore because this was the wild, wild west of education. But he decided that the whole year, the class would learn about India. And in my first term, he raised the money to build a Rama and Sita puppet show. So all of the kids in the class made literal hand puppets, the Indian way, Indian hand puppets. And we built the stage. The local Indian band came and gave us free lessons with all of the different instruments. So by the end of the year, we had put on this play of Rama and Sita, and I got to be Sita. And that was the first time I was ever included outside of my family and outside of my community in what I considered to be at the time a true Indian experience. And much later, when I graduated from university and I decided I wouldn't be a lawyer and I wanted to be a journalist, I joined a newsroom in London. And in that newsroom, I was the only Black person and the only mixed person and the only Caribbean. I was the only everything, the only Caribbean, but the only everything. And a woman came and her name was Kavita Maharaj. And she had an American accent, but she had a flavor, but I couldn't identify it. And on my first day, she said to me, "Where are your people from?" And I said, "Jamaica." And she said, "Who in your family is Indian?" And I said, "My mom." And she said in her Trinidadian accent, and forgive me because my accent's so bad, but she said, "Well, you're mine, no." And she taught me everything I needed to know to be excellent. And then she said to me, after about 3 months, she said to me, "You shouldn't stay here, you should go to America." I said, "How am I going to go to America? Schooling in England is free. I can't afford like $100,000 to go to America. My parents don't have that kind of money." And she said, "Don't worry, we'll get you a scholarship." She went through all of my applications with me. She had suggested which schools I should apply to. And one of them was the University of Miami. And at that time, I already knew that the University of Miami housed most of the Indian Caribbean histories, papers, everything. And so it was on my radar, but they didn't offer a scholarship that I was aware of. And so I made the application, I did what she said, I applied everywhere, and I won a full academic scholarship to the University of Miami. At that stage, I didn't know that's where Kavita graduated from. And I didn't know she was on the board or the scholarship board or anything like that. So if it wasn't for Kavita, I would not have probably been able to study in the United States. And I definitely wouldn't have won that scholarship. And please don't misunderstand, it doesn't mean that I wasn't worthy of the scholarship, because academically I was. I just had somebody to invest in me and help me all the way, despite my pedigree of being both Indian and African. And my last significant experience was when I was in Qatar. I spent 4 years at Al Jazeera in Doha. And there was another guy who was also Indian and African mixed, but he was from Malawi. And every minute he was in and out of the Indian embassy. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm going for my citizenship. I said, from where? I said, who, what are you talking about? And he said, I'm going to be Indian. I said, how are you going to be Indian? He said, if you can prove your great grandparents come from India up to your great grandparents, then you can be an Indian citizen. And I said, I can do that. I have all of the paperwork. My family collected everything. Then he said, well, you can be Indian too. And so I went to the embassy because I'm fast. And I met with the deputy ambassador, the Indian deputy ambassador to Qatar. And I told him my family history, my whole story. And I asked him, would it be possible? Is it really true? And he said, yes, as long as you can prove that at least your great grandparent, one of them at least was born in India, you have a right to citizenship. And I said to him, I was so overwhelmed, I couldn't even believe it was true. I said to him, would you help me? And he said, yes. I didn't complete the process, but knowing that somebody wasn't going to deny me because I was not 100% Indian, or I wasn't the wrong kind of Indian or a Creolized Indian, was so heartwarming to me. It made me want to go to India more. It made me want to explore from the roots that side of my heritage more. So my biggest thing is inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. You have to accept all parts of us. The idea that being Indian is being purist and having a pure bloodline isn't conducive for the way our societies are developing in the Caribbean in particular. And Indian and African mixed people, we have our own culture, which isn't African or African Caribbean, and it isn't Indian Caribbean, because we draw on, it's not just about being creolized, we draw on different parts of our experience. So when I was growing up, we celebrated Diwali. I still do that. I still celebrate Christmas a little bit. And I have lived in the Middle East for so long that I feel quite Arabized, and I will always, well, I don't fast for Ramadan, but I definitely partake in Eid. So my experience is such that I can enjoy all aspects of everything that makes up who I am without having to choose. And in engaging in one aspect of myself or the other doesn't mean I'm less loyal to the other. Indian arrival day in Jamaica is May the 10th, and the first Indians arrived in 1845. Oh, and I didn't pierce my nose till I went to India, and this is me having my street piercing on my nose in India, because I'm afraid of pain. Generally, I've got quite a low pain threshold, and this was it might not be a big deal for other people, but it was a big deal for me, because you're on the roadside, they put an X on your nose and they stab you with, I don't even know what it is, a needle. It's very, what most, I guess, Westerners would call archaic, but I wanted it to be traditional. I wanted it to be in India, and I wanted an Indian specialist to do it.
Nadine, let me interrupt you for just a second, please. It is now 20 minutes since you've been speaking.
Oh, okay. So let me move on real quick. Our mixed and creolization makes us no less Indian. It's just a different kind. There isn't one way to be anything. And this is 3 generations of my family. We've been in Jamaica for 4 generations now, and we will never forget. The end.
Perfect timing there. I want to sincerely thank you for giving us some insights into your personal life and being so candid about it as well. Our audience will be invited to pose questions to you and the other speakers, but at the end of all the presentations. So please stay with us for that. And thank you again for enlightening us about your experience of being a Dougla.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now move on to our second speaker, and this is Dr. Suan Barrett of Trinidad and Tobago. She's a lecturer and the head at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine. She is the co-author with Dr. Alia Singh, who you will hear from next. They are co-authors of the book entitled Dougla in the 21st Century, Adding to the Mix. Welcome, Dr. Barrett. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the last presenter for sharing your personal experiences, which incidentally were the kind of experiences that Dr. Singh and I shall call her Alia for now, Alia and I explored as we worked on our publication, Dougla in the 21st Century. And some of it sounds very, very much recognizable. Some reminds us of the traumas that we experienced as mixed people. And some, of course, shows that we can, in fact, define ourselves as we so desire, as you ended. So thank you very much, Nadine, for sharing your perspective. Also, thank you for having us here. We are very happy to join the conversation. And we directly address the question, Indianization, Creolisation, or both, and respond by suggesting, segueing from what was said by the last presenter, that Douglas are maneuvering subjects. Maneuvering subjects. Today, we contemplate this as a direct response, and we hope that through our discussion that we will hear from people their perspective as they listen to what we share. We reflect on how this finds meaning in Dougla lives, and if it even has meaning for them, i.e., how they come to understand themselves as mixed, as multiracial, as biracial, and so much more. We assert how Douglas describe their own experience of their relations within and beyond their families and communities. And we will borrow from our findings and evaluations from this publication. I am a feminist academic and I claim my subjectivity. I myself am a person who is mixed in Trinidad and Tobago. I am a multiracial person. I'm a multiracial Dougla, if you want to say. I've got a little bit of everything. So that is quite common in Trinidad and Tobago. So I speak from a place of understanding this multiplicity. What is our core position? Douglas are perpetually maneuvering subjects. So Douglas maneuver to, they maneuver within, they maneuver away from race, ethnic, cultural influences, right? They maneuver to, within, and away from these influences. Douglas are modified by necessary Indianness. What does that mean? You must wear, your body must be marked sufficiently by Indianness to be recognized as mixed and to be recognized as enough mixed to be Dougla, though not Indian. And one is also rooted in Blackness because Blackness / Africanness operates as of default, having been mixed with two races or more, depending on the persons who have come together in a biracial or multiracial pairing. So this is the reality expressed by the Douglas that we interviewed, that Indianness is necessary modifier, Blackness is necessary default. But Douglas assert without question that they are nothing more than Dougla. They are just Dougla, to use their language in a direct quotation. Further, how do they maneuver? Because we theorize, we introduce this conceptual language to talk about Dougla's actions, ways of being and doing themselves in the everyday and the extraordinary. Douglas contemplate the experience of mixedness as an experience of maneuvering, an act of maneuvering, a performative act, in that it is repeated every day, every minute of their lives. It is a meaning-making process. They come to be known, and they express themselves as noble through this process of maneuvering, right? This meaning-making process is enacted by them who live in between, never split, to go back to the calypso, In-betweenness of mixedness, whatever one is mixed with, be it 2, 3, 4, 6, one lives in liminality, in-betweenness, giving them a site for recognizable connection. This repeated action is performed in order to situate self in compliance with or in resistance to the state of in-betweenness and in relation to belonging. So one may occur as a move to a racial system, be it a Caribbean system, a global North system, another part of the global South. One is always in response. And this system has with it definitions and discourses that Douglas, as a mixed race group, maneuver to, within, or away from. So it's an act of skillful and deliberate meaning making. Douglas live both privilege and trauma. They also live without either, or just on the cusp of. Everyone is unique, but they are skillful in the status position they occupy, looking broadly at multiple heritages. So they are skillful and deliberate in making sense of themselves and others. And it has force in its expression. An expression that is deployed not only repeatedly, but routinely with each situation or encounter. So we suggest that based on the research that we have done, based on our own experiences as mixed people ourselves, that at least in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, and to some degree through Alia's experiences in the United States, that it's neither a case of Indianization, nor Creolization, nor both, but Douglas perpetually, necessarily maneuver belonging. Douglas in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, they maneuver their bodies and their cultural relevance, how your hair looks, how your body shape, your skin color, your facial features, what neighborhood you live in, what traditions you're familiar with, what you do, what religion, all of the above. They choose proactive and strategic decisions to fit within different spaces and places. As one told us, I dress in different ways depending on where I'm going and who I'm with. I can foreground a part of myself, a side of myself to blend in or to stand out. They thus disrupt the state of in-betweenness that they tend to experience and feign belongingness, not to be deceiving, but in order to marry themselves to the occasion, even when such is not automatically granted, because acceptance and belonging is by no means automatic or guaranteed. Douglas thus maneuvered to, within, away from forced choices. The last speaker spoke about you can choose to be a part of yourself, and it does not mean you are disloyal or more loyal to any part. But you do not, Douglas in particular, do not subject themselves to being forced to choose or become anything else other than that which they have strategically maneuvered to. They maneuver ethnic group or political party loyalties, especially in a space like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. As they maneuver, they are evaluated, contend with recognition of self in relation to how they are recognized by others. Are you enough of anything to actually be something? Well, for a Dougla, you're just Dougla. So Douglas often ask, where do I fit because of this Douglaness? Where do I fit? How am I recognized? Maneuvering recognition, Douglas experience some uncertainty. And that's okay, because remember, they're living in this space of nuance. They understand that their mixedness is not automatic. Their bodies must qualify, and Alia will speak more to that. Douglas explained their mixedness as a result of a process of intersubjective, between people, between groups, between communities, meaning making that emerged through a conversation between how they recognize themselves and how they are recognized by others. So they're always maneuvering these influences, these ideas. That's why it's not one or the other set of influences. It's a set of, a myriad, always intertwined and interconnected, a network of influences that is maneuvered. One 22-year-old female said, I remember the first time I noticed that being mixed was a thing. I remember I was in lower 6. I was studying for Caribbean Studies. Lower 6, by the way, is, for those who are not from the Caribbean, that is the early class and post-secondary advanced training before university. I was studying for Caribbean Studies with a group of people, and there were these 3 guys that were predominantly of African descent, and we were talking about something in history. And they asked me, how did I feel having no history in Trinidad? Because I was not one or the other, African or Indian. So this Dougla realized, wait now, well, how I was thinking about myself is not how others would have been seeing me. So they were maneuvering how that person was maneuvering, how she was recognized, and then would have responded, but we didn't elaborate. It's just an example. They also maneuver, as I said earlier, political party affiliation, being caught in the middle, especially when things are volatile, hostile, and hot when elections are due. Because in Trinidad and Tobago, we are situated amid a politics that was founded in the anti-colonial movement as African and Indian descended persons attempted to build an independent nation, grappling with a colonial legacy, a deliberate one, to suggest disencounters when there have been so many encounters, a legacy of ethno-racial divide, which the Douglas stands up against in contradiction to. So Douglas then have to negotiate. They may do so through silence, through expression, through distancing, whatever a particular individual may choose, these political affiliations, because fundamentally, the question is, so who are you voting for? None of your business. I'm caught in the middle. Maneuvering belonging in the family. Our last speaker spoke about that to some degree for her younger sibling. And while many may have a wonderful experience in their family relationship, or some may have a horrid experience, depending on who you would have spoken to from our sample, one person said something, they had a pretentious relationship, which spoke to inauthenticity. Some Douglas are forced at a very young age to encounter the tensions between primarily Indian and primarily African descended family members. Now, we say primarily because there's a presumption of purity of one as Indian or African, and in a place like Trinidad and Tobago in particular, this presumption of purity is quite tenuous, uncertain, and rooted in a colonial past that is deliberate, right? So in this, they contend with the remnants of that colonial past and colonial social relations that have constructed and fostered tensions and political divisions. And so for a Dougla, they always are compelled to maneuver acceptance or rejection within their own families, depending on how they looked, how they act, what they do, who they are. Intimacy and closeness or distance, and of course, racial stereotypes. And these are all tensions that are featured in their lives, in their lived experience, and they discussed it with us, or we have discussed it with each other. So they maneuver to within away from ethno-racial affiliations. They're like, you know what? This doesn't really work out for me. I will never be one, other, or all. I am always an amalgam. I am just Dougla. You can't just say you're only related to one. That would be inauthentic. Douglas often find themselves confronted by pressure to align with one ancestor group, but they choose not to. Regis, who also wrote on Douglas, explains that they can choose to do so without claiming Dougla or their distinct mixed identity, or they can choose to align with neither and instead claim a national identity. I'm a Trini, I'm a Togonian, I'm a Guyanese, I'm a Jamaican. But fundamentally, all we spoke to, they're just Dougla. So to conclude, before I pass the mantle over to my colleague, for contemporary Douglas, the process of belonging is multiple, multidimensional, and at times contradictory. And that's part of their lived reality. Belonging in one space does not translate to all spaces. Belonging can never be presumed if one lives as Dougla. Dougla embodiment of Africanness, Indianness, or mixedness mediates belonging or unbelonging. The Dougla body that is sufficiently mixed or bears the marker of enoughness, bears the marker of the modifier, is able to maneuver marked ethno-racial and cultural spaces and can claim belonging anywhere. But not all have this privilege because bodies are different. There is no one phenotype that is the Dougla phenotype, which is why Alia and I always refrain from using pictures, because one picture is never representative of the whole community of Douglas. Some Douglas are compelled to choose sides amid a self-identification or claiming that they are just Dougla, or because of their mixedness, both racially and culturally, they identify with everyone. So while the Dougla experience is not a homogeneous one, it is one that is marked by an understanding of oneself as different and maneuvering self because of this difference. I thank you for your time and attention and turn you back over to the moderator.
We thank you, Dr. Barrett, a very insightful and enlightening presentation. Thank you so much. Let's just go straight into Dr. Alia Ranjit Singh's presentation. She is from Trinidad, but now based in the US. She's an assistant professor of Caribbean Studies in the Africana Studies Department of Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. Welcome, Alia. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Shalima. I'm going to share my screen. And just sort of situate everything here. Great. So it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahabir, for inviting Suan and myself. Also, thank you, Nadine. Your presentation really resonated with myself, with Suan, and it very much, it speaks to what we have written in our book. Right? So thank you so much. So I follow from my esteemed colleague, Dr. Barrett, my eloquent colleague, Dr. Barrett. And my presentation is entitled The Dougla as Maneuvering Subject, Interpreting Self in the Caribbean Diaspora. So closely following Dr. Barrett, Suan. So I'm following her presentation to now elaborate on maneuvering as a Dougla strategic act, also performed in the Caribbean diaspora, specifically New York City, New York, especially as the Dougla encounters a new system or process of racialization. And when I say racialization, I mean the process by which race and raced bodies come to have meaning. And specifically in the US, I'm talking about that black-white color line. So in my presentation, my part of the presentation, in contemplating a direct response, to the question posed, we reflect on how Douglas encounter, right, this different process of racialization in the Caribbean diaspora. And we assert how Douglas maneuver Douglaness and defaults in the global North. And of course, we continue to share the findings and the evaluations from our joint publication. Now, an interrogation of Dougla experiences in the diaspora, right? It puts us directly within, migration studies and numerous studies which have documented the process of racialization of Afro-Caribbean immigrants in the United States of America. Now, Cassanets, who is a scholar on migration studies, he has stated that for Afro-Caribbean immigrants, they experience the double process of coming simultaneously into America and into Black America. So in this day, immigrants, like myself, right, we face a different, often conflicting, definition of our racial identity, right, in the sending and receiving societies. So how is the Dougla situated in all of this, right? As we have learned from Sue, in the Caribbean space, the Dougla is understood as a form of mixedness, as Indianness mediating Blackness. And we see that it is how the body is overtly marked, which allows for qualification as Dougla. In that Indianness, again, right, must modify sufficiently that body for qualification as Dougla. So in this way, qualification based on phenotype, it complicates the politics of identity for the Dougla, even more so when the Dougla is removed from the Caribbean, and where the cultural knowledge of Indianness, Africanness, and Douglaness are, of course, easily understood. So, of course, the Dougla body outside of the Caribbean and in the US finds itself in a space where Dougla is not understood. And often attempts to identify and evaluate oneself legitimately as Dougla are further complicated by an unfamiliar system of racial categorization. And this, of course, is very personal to me, or for me, particularly, as a Dougla who, migrated to New York City. And, and having to encounter a different system of race, a different process of racialization, where Indianness, Africanness, and Douglaness was not and is not easily understood. And of course, this system of racial categorization is very much, centers the rule of hypodescent. And when I speak of hypodescent, I speak of, classifying or identifying biracial or multiracial persons as a member of the lower or the lowest socially ranking racial group from which that person has ancestry. So of course, this rule of hypodescent, which has informed the one-drop rule in the US, right, it ascribes Blackness to those who are mixed with Black. So while the Dougla is afforded recognition as an example of mixedness in the Caribbean space, the Dougla may be denied this in the US space and may not be able to claim legitimately, Douglaness in that way. So, how do Douglas maneuver? And of course, I remind you, of maneuvering, as discussed by Suan in the previous, presentation. And maneuvering is very significant, right, in the way in which Douglas encounter this new system of racialization and Blackness in the US. Right, so do Douglas, move to the racial system? Do they move, from this new racial system? Do they move, within this new racial system that they're encountering? Well, how do Douglas maneuver, particularly in New York City? And of course, for our joint publication, we interviewed over 100 Douglas in Trinidad and also in New York, where I am based. So the first way in which our respondents discussed how they maneuver Douglaness, and of course, to and within the racial systems in the US, is maneuvering defaults. And the default referred to here is Blackness. So Blackness is the default modified by Indianness, which qualifies mixedness. So Douglas maneuvered this relationship between default and modifier in Caribbean homeland spaces, as of course discussed by Suan, but they also maneuver similarly in the US context, where with its particular set of racialized discourses, we see that the Douglas that we interviewed, they tend to maneuver to and within the default, that is Blackness and Africanness, rather than the modifier Indianness or Indianness and other. And I think a very important, quote, to allow us to understand this maneuvering, to and within the default, is actually one of our female respondents in her late 20s, right, who's often read as Black or African American in New York. She explained how she does this. So in terms of how she self-identifies, she said, well, I describe myself as a Black American of Caribbean heritage. So, of course, what are the conditions which have, caused for this self-identification? She said, I'm forcibly seen as Dougla or mixed because of my dark skin. My hair is questioned. She said, I'm not light skinned or red or brown skinned. I do not have curly hair. My hair is locked. And of course, red in this case is a descriptor used in Trinidad and Tobago. And the person who was described as red is someone of African descent who was of a lighter complexion. And here we have this woman, this young woman describing herself as Black American. And she says again, she's forcibly seen as Dougla. And we are reminded, that the Dougla must be sufficiently modified by Indianness, especially in terms of hair, and in some cases, skin color, to qualify as Dougla. So in many ways, right, she chooses the default, right, as opposed to maneuvering to the modifier Indianness or Indianness and other, because of the way that she wears Indianness, or maybe the lack of Indianness that is on her body. There are also those who maneuver ambiguity. So the Dougla whose embodiment affords more more than maneuverability. To and within Blackness maneuvers ambiguity. Good. So the Dougla must be modified enough by Indianists, as I said before, right? So in terms of hair, skin color, etc., to qualify for the mixed categorization Dougla. So the effect of the strategic meaning making through choice of label constitutes not the monoracial, but intriguingly, ambiguous. In this case, they do not maneuver as compelled by the interpretations of others, but by choice, exercising some agency in their self-definition. And yet those who, maneuver, as an expression of resistance, in that they refuse to engage in racial accounting. And of course, what is racial accounting? When someone comes up to you and asks you, well, what are you? What are you mixed with? And there's some of us who very much reject, these questions. We reject being forced, to account for our ancestry, particularly the Dougla, right? Many of us, like myself, we don't want to go in, well, in 1838, the British, go to India and, Indian indentureship, begins, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, we see maneuvering in this way, of course, as an act of resistance. And particularly in terms of maneuvering ambiguity, it is, those Douglas who are mixed enough, sufficiently mixed, who are able to maneuver in this way. And there was one particular young woman who we interviewed in her late 30s, early 40s, and she said, in college, her peers called her Sade. So I'm not sure if we know who Sade is, right? So the Nigerian, British, singer, songwriter. And if we know who she is, we can then, of course, picture what this respondent very much, looks like. And this respondent said, that she's able to maneuver, right, through manipulating her look, right? So depending on how she styles her hair, be it curly, be it straight, right? She said, that one day she could be the Indian girl. One day she could be the Jewish girl. One day she could be the Spanish girl. And again, it's only those Douglas who are sufficiently mixed, right, are able to maneuver ambiguity, of course, in this way. And there are those who maneuver privilege. So the Dougla body marked by visible mixedness can be experienced as a privilege. And for us, to understand maneuvering in this way, we have pulled another quote from our publication. So this 26-year-old female respondent explained that privilege is at once taken for granted, but it's not guaranteed. So let's read. So she says, I'm sorry, I'm blocking the camera. She says, she says, I would just be mixed, but abroad I was read as Black. There were no ifs, ands, or buts, but that I would get in the North and the US and Canada, like people would ask, where are you from? Or what are you in general? Like Black Americans and Canadians would ask me if I was mixed with anything sometimes, but I definitely felt I was more Black than anything. But that consciousness took a while because of years of convent, right? So convent are these, private, prestigious, all-girl Catholic run, schools in Trinidad, right? And years of mixed privilege in Trinidad. She said, it didn't hit me until like month 4 or 5 that people were treating me a certain way because I was Black. I was like, oh, I'm Black. This is why. Wow, this is funny. I didn't realize before, but now I know that I'm Black because in Trinidad, you could exist as mixed and Black. And there's privilege in being mixed. So we see that this privilege, while taken for granted in the Caribbean, as she explained, is not given relevance in the United States or other contexts external to the home space. So we see the way in which this respondent maneuvers identity to the compelled, not by claiming, but by acknowledging the shifting meanings of her body, right, as she moves from place to place. So, we ponder that, first question, Indianization, Creolisation, or both. And of course, there were those Douglas who maneuver consciousness. And when I speak of consciousness, I speak of the ways in which Douglas come to understand themselves. So Dougla consciousness may mediate mixedness as a political experience tied to other social identities like religion and social projects. Their consciousness as Caribbean post-colonial embraces a consciousness of their ancestry. In that, the Dougla is very much steeped in this ancestry, Indianness and Africanness, and as Nadine had mentioned in her presentation, celebrating Diwali, celebrating Eid. And this is how I grew up, as well, right? I often tell people I grew up in a Muslim, Christian, Hindu household. I know what it is to light diyas for Diwali. I know what it is to get up every morning and say prayers with my Muslim grandmother. I know what it is to go to church, Christian church, on a Sunday, right? And that, as Dougla, I'm steeped in all of this, right? And I maneuver the way that I understand myself, right? Within, all of these. So as I, summarize, we see, of course, that maneuverability is a Dougla strategic enactment and performance of self that is dependent on both external and internal forces. So it allows for what one scholar in review of another scholar describes as the ability of the mixed or multiracial. And this is so important here, to interrogate multiple identities into a more complex whole. So, as Nadine said, as Sue said, there's no splitting in two, right? There's no splitting in two that's happening, there are these multiple identities that come together as this complex whole. So particularly in New York City, right, as a Caribbean diasporic space, it allows the Dougla to be Dougla and not be Dougla at the same time. Right, so I will end there, and I can't wait for the discussion and the questions, and also to engage with Nadine as well. Thank you.
Dr. Ranjit Singh, thank you. It was a very informative presentation. I'm seeing comments. It was excellent. So I too am looking forward to the questions. Thank you very much for sharing with us. We'll move on now to our fourth speaker, and this is Marlon Padiachi of South Africa. He's the CEO and founder of MAP Media Green Gold Consulting. He's also an alumni ambassador for the City University of London and a media strategist, publisher, and journalist. Welcome, Marlon. You can go ahead with your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, it may take him a few seconds to connect because we understand that there is some load shedding taking place in South Africa. It's a little bit late there as well. Marlon, can you unmute your mic? I know that he's here. I'm hoping that he's hearing us. Marlon, are you hearing us? Okay, I'm seeing your mic unmuted. We're not hearing you. Marlon, can you turn on your video? Okay. So I saw you on video a second ago. Would you go ahead with your presentation, please? We're still not hearing you.
I think he's having some difficulty with the internet.
Still.
Yeah.
Marlon, please send me a message if you're able to go ahead with your presentation. You can message in the chat because we're not hearing you. Okay, I'm not getting any messages from him at this point in time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think what we should do is move on with. Okay, let me just check that. Let's just have our very own Dr. Kumar Mahabir speak. He's speaking today in his capacity as an anthropologist, an author, university lecturer, and of course, the executive director of this particular weekly Sunday Zoom program. He is a discussant for today's program. Dr. Mahabir, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much. I too am experiencing some internet challenges, and so I had to switch laptop. So I am using another one, not the regular one. So first, let me thank the presenters. You were all excellent. Work well articulated, well presented, and we had two kinds of presentation, one very personal and one heavily academic. So we had a variety there, a mix, if we may use that term. I want to begin by saying that hybridity is not a new topic, nor is it a new social construct. It has been there since time immemorial, since evolution, when you had mixtures of tribes and castes and religion. It can take all kinds of dimensions and appearances. And before I forget, I want to acknowledge Fern in Dr. Fern in the audience. She is, I think, written the first book on Douglas in Trinidad, right? So congratulations, Fern, and we want to hear from you. So because of colonialism, you had all kinds of mixtures. You have the mestizo, you had the mulatto, and I learned a lot about the mulatto through my favorite poet and writer, Caribbean writer, and that is Derek Walcott. He wrote a lot about all the dilemmas and the traumas and the navigation, as Suan and Alia mentioned, and maneuverness that he had to undergo. And then you have the Dougla. Now, Dougla in Guyana is pronounced Dougla. And actually, I was speaking to someone from Fiji who was visiting Trinidad yesterday in person, and she mentioned, it says, curse word. Don't ever use the word Dougla in Fiji. So there has been Douglarization even from the time of indentureship, when Indians came here. And what I would like to see in the future research, because I'm sure this is not the last, papers and books and so on are going to come out on Douglarization. This is just the beginning. And I want to see Douglas and Douglarization in the context of the politics, particularly in Trinidad and Guyana. Because Douglarization has been pushed by the Afro-led PNM party in Trinidad since 1956, with Eric Williams being the first prime minister. All the data shows, all the surveys and polls and so on, way back from Sevin Ryan with the ISCR unit, and recently with Vishnu Bisram and his North American Teachers Association polling group have shown that Douglas tend to vote for the PNM by and large. So what Eric Williams realized that early, and so he brought allowed a lot of immigrants to come in, Black immigrants from the neighboring countries, and so it swelled the and increased the vote bank for the PNM. So it was really not racially intended, but more political. So I'd like to see that the more research on the politics of Douglarization in its widest sense, particularly in this case with party politics, because as we know in Trinidad and Guyana, people vote along tribal lines, ethnic lines. They are ethnic-based parties. And we know how Douglas vote from the polls that we have seen. Patrick Manning, being a past prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago, leader of the PNM, he had introduced the word social engineering to increase the number of Douglas, to encourage Douglarization by building government houses, the housing scheme in Indian-dominated areas. So this term social engineering is not mine. It was used by Manning openly as one of his methods of securing victory for the PLM and retaining victory. And so he used this as a tool, as a weapon to win elections. Now, interestingly, I work in Guyana, so I can tell you about Guyana. I've been, and I'm from Trinidad, so I can compare the two societies. Very, very similar. Actually, if you know Trinidad, you know Guyana and vice versa. And but in Guyana, there is more racial tension and competition to the extent that it turns into violence. We have never really had racial violence here in Trinidad, but Guyana has a history of that, going back to the Wisma massacre or Wisma ethnic cleansing in 1964, where an entire Indian community was chased out. And many people may think that if Douglarization is a good thing, which it is, but in Guyana, it is interesting to note that there are severe divisions among the two major races, the Indians and Africans, yet the number of Douglas is increasing dramatically. So the two largest ethnic groups in Guyana, two largest ethnic groups that are increasing in number are the Amerindians and the Douglas. So this is again another suggestion for researchers to look at societies. How can you have such divided societies and yet you have Douglarization increasing? Now, Nadine, Mirage, I want to commend you highly for exuding that and displaying and publicizing that pride that you have in that half Indian side or in your blood, that heritage, and letting us know more about it, how you have not only identified with Indian as part of your mixed identity, but you have also celebrated it. And that was really heartwarming for everybody, and more so because you presented it from a personal perspective, that narrative which was very touching when you talk about the trauma that you attended and the pulling your hair and all of that, and the support from the Indian family and Indians who were not related to you. So and your search for your roots and to find out more about your ancestry and visiting India and all of that, celebrating Diwali, Eid in your arrival day. That was very good, because here it is you are claiming and celebrating both identities. So you are at an advantage in being Dougla. So both Suan's and Alia, if I may call you that by your first name, heavily academic presentations. But when I read the bio, the little bio that I have of Suan, I noted that she has studied and written on Carnival, which is really an Afrocentric celebration. It's not national at all, as we would claim to be, because 7 Days Adventists and the Muslims don't take part in it at all. And the key performers and the players of Carnival are largely people of African descent. How many Indians play Pan? How many Indians play Moko Jombi? How many Indians participate in the Kanbule? How many Indians sing calypsos? So I would like, I'm sure Suan is young, and I'm sure she is going to explore other cultural Indo-based festivals and ceremonies in Trinidad. This is just the start of this work on Douglas and Douglarization. But both she and Alia spoke about maneuvering and navigating the identity of the Dougla so that they use their mixed race identity to their advantage, right? So it's an advantage in a lot of sense. Now, while Alia did talk about her observance of Eid and Diwali and all of that, it doesn't come out in your academic work. Because when I look at your bio again, of course, I did research on all of you as the discussants, responsible discussant. I noted that you studied the Black Panthers. You studied Black Lives Matter. You studied Afro-Trinidadians and Afro-Caribbean in the diaspora, not Indian diaspora, not Indians in the diaspora. We note the work, pioneering work of Mahin Hussain in the 80s and others, and that is ceased, and I think the gap has to be filled. So I want to suggest to you, Alia, that you also include the Indians in your academic research. And generally, your research is on the Black experience in the diaspora, Black experience in Africa, Black experience in the Caribbean. And I think you are privileged, as Derek Walcott is, as a mulatto, and he's written a lot about this, to not only identify, but claim your ancestry and claim that other part of you, which is in your blood, which is in your DNA. So I want to conclude by saying that more research has to be done, definitely. This is a very complex topic, and all can't be said in one book, all can't be said in one 50-minute presentation. I agree with you. We need to hear male Douglas. And from the male perspective, we had 3 presenters today, they're all female. And many people propose that Douglarization is a solution for all this ethnic acrimony and competition and rivalry and all of that. Well, that is not so, because when we look at the Hutus and Tutsi in Rwanda, all the same race. When we look at Jamaica, a lot of gang killings. When we look at Jamaica, when we look at Trinidad right here, it's the same race. And 2 and 3 murders every day in Trinidad, Black on Black crime. So I don't think this suggested solution of Douglarization will really bring peace to the society. And in doing your research, more research, I'm very, very sure you're going to do more research. You have to look, as I said before, the political affiliation of Douglas and the cultural orientation. What music do Douglas play? If they have a choice to go to Africa or India, one choice, which one would they choose first? And as Douglas generally as a group, I am not addressing you personally here, who are your friends? Who is your boyfriend or who is your girlfriend? Who is your wife? Who is your husband? So these are questions that we have to ask. And if it is that Dougla women are not gravitating to Indian men or find them adorable as boyfriends or as husbands, it is because they are really the victims of biased media. As an academic like yourself, I have done research. It's on the internet, academia, edu, to show that Indian men are hardly portrayed in advertisements in Trinidad and Tobago. Hardly. So they are not the heroes. You don't see them. They have been erased. They are invisible. So, Madam Moderator, I'd like to end here. Thank you very much.
So if you don't find Indian men adorable, how do you find them? Dr. Mahabir, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to open the floor now to questions. Dr. Rampasad already has her hand up, but let me just mention this. If you have a question, you have a comment, or you would like to make a contribution, please raise your electronic hand. It is in the reactions button, which is at the base of your computer screen. Only then would our IT manager, Singh, allow you to speak. So please go ahead and indicate whether or not you would indeed like to pose a question or a comment. Dr. Rampasad, please go ahead with your question. She's been waiting for quite a while.
Right, so I'm on mute. I was waiting because, you know, I think Dr. Mahabir's comments were highly provocative and to some extent share some of my own concerns. What he talked about Douglarization and Eric Williams social engineering to get into the political debate, I don't think it was so much social engineering as political engineering or political maneuvering, if we want to call it that, because it was definitely designed to influence the vote toward the PNM. And this is not new, and certainly not new in the Western Hemisphere. The United States government had sort of implemented a policy in Cuba and tried to encourage, because they had control of Cuba for some time, to some extent through the Platt Amendment in 1902, they tried to implement what was known as a miscegenization, which is the same mixing of the races. And this was designed to prevent another black, what they call a black specter that had emanated from Haiti, and which earlier on had led to the Haitian Revolution, to celebrate Haitian Revolution. So it is a very, very normal strategy. It is a very common strategy that is used by politicians playing the ethnic card, as we say it. And they do it all the time, particularly in ethnically diverse populations, and where you have two large ethnic groups like Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, even in the United States to some extent, although they call them minorities, some of them as insignificant numbers, the Afro-American and the Latino-American votes, as we call it. So it is a very common election strategy. It's a very common political strategy. And it's not designed for real and genuine social integration amongst the population. And I think this is a point Dr. Mahabir was making. What we find, it's not just in Trinidad and Tobago, we have about 22% persons of mixed descent. And that is not just of Dougla. Okay, so we know Dougla is a combination of Indo and Afro, but we also have multiple others like the Spaniards, the Spanish, the French, the English, the whites, all kinds of mixtures we have here, the melted pot as we call it. But that constitutes 22%. And the bulk of them, and Dr. Mahabir said the Douglas generally vote PNM, but the bulk of the mixed population generally vote PNM. The polls have shown that the mixed population gravitate towards the PNM party, and that could be part of the political engineering. I don't want to call it social engineering, but the political engineering. And it is not really, like I said, a genuine attempt at social integration. The mixed population, including the Douglas, are also more culturally inclined towards the Afro culture than the Indo culture. Even though in the case of the Dougla, one parent might be Indian and one African, the inclination, and I'm talking here the cultural inclination now, is towards the Afro culture rather than the Indo culture. And that may also influence the vote, the political vote. So basically, I think when we're studying this, there are different dimensions, and sometimes it's very difficult to delineate them, the social from the political, because they're so intricately interwoven, and in some respects, perpetuated, encourage some of this very, what I would say, miscegenization, Douglarization, whatever, is encouraged for political purposes by some of our leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rampasad. Dr. Barrett, would you like to comment on Dr. Rampasad's comments?
Yes, but I saw Shani Bullock had her hand up first. So
Mhm.
should I go and then Shani goes, or should I make way for Shani?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, okay. So there are a few things I wanted to attend to. From our research with us, as Alia would have said, over 100 Douglas, both in Trinidad and Tobago, a few from Guyana and some in the United States. Dougla subjectivity, Dougla identity, Dougla selfhood, Dougla relations in their family is very different from Douglarization. So I think it's very important for us not to conflate the two. Douglas themselves do not promote the idea of Douglarization because race, ethnic mixing, interracial unions are not a solution to a political problem. It creates a great deal of trauma on their lives, on their psyches, on their beings, and on their selves. So I think it's really important that we internalize the understanding that Dougla subjectivity is a human who has biracial or multiracial ancestry and loyalties to all of the above, but it's not in any way a solution to political rifts. The other thing I wanted to also clarify is that Douglas were very clear when they spoke to us about their political affiliation. I don't know where the statistics come from, but they are very clear that for them, encountering a two-party system that seems to speak to tribal affiliations where their affiliation is always blurry, they then either remove themselves from their franchise or they choose based on information. So some of the younger ones, especially 18 to 25 to 30, would say, I'm going to look at what is presented to me in a manifesto or in a documentation or whatever. I'm not going to fall into somewhere that I am inherently excluded. So that's the second one. If we're trying to understand political trends in Dougla voting behavior, it is unpredictable and the trends are misleading, at least based on the Douglas that we spoke to over the 5-year period. And finally, I also wanted to say that where Alia and I spoke about how Douglas maneuver modifiers and defaults, Blackness being a default, Blackness or Africanness, and Indianness, as well as other admixture being the modifier. A Dougla can also be mixed with Chinese, white, and other things, but that is a multiracial person, somebody like myself. And they may not always wear it on their body. But a person who maneuvers defaults and modifiers will always tend to be compelled to the default, depending on how they look. So if we observe that a Dougla person does not claim Indianness, it's not always that they do not wish to. As they say, I can't choose one. Right? We had a quote, I choose all. I choose my Indian ancestry, I choose my African ancestry, and anything else I may have. But sometimes, depending on who that Dougla is and their embodiment, they are excluded from a claim to that ancestry because they are not enough. So that's why they maneuver belonging, recognition, and trying to understand where they may fit. So yes, we can do further research to see how one encounters one's Indianness, a necessary part of Douglaness, but we also have to appreciate that there is the politics of identity that either removes one as qualifying or allows one to qualify. And it, of course, depends on your family and your neighborhood and all of these other things. So I just wanted to comment on those things. To just be very clear, Douglarization and Dougla subjectivity is very different, that Douglas maneuver these influences and that Douglas definitely are negotiating defaults and modifiers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Barrett. Let's now call upon our Jamaican sister, Shani Bullock. Go ahead, please, Shani. Thanks for your patience. You need to unmute.
Hello?
Yes, we're hearing you now.
Hello, everybody. Absolutely wonderful presentation. Sue, you just hit the nail on the head. First of all, being in the Caribbean, we don't realize how blessed we are to be able to embrace all the bits and pieces that we're composed of. I call myself a proud mongrel because I'm so mixed, and I'm very proud of that. I was listening, and the situation in the UK, the situation in the US, where you're almost forced to choose a side, seems incredibly painful. I can just very quickly say that my husband's family is Indian. When they went to the UK, they had a similar situation where not wanting to identify too much with the Indians on the ground because they were called Pakis. So going back to the default, yes, they would consider themselves colored or Caribbean colored or Caribbean black, because in England, they are asking you to tick a box. Who do you tick? All right, so that's one thing. Nadine, you spoke about the names. In my case, we heard more about Coolie Royal. So if you were mixed, you'd hear Coolie Royal or you'd hear Chinese Royal, that the royal bit, meaning you were black and white. So we didn't have that term, Dougla, here in Jamaica. It was, you're a Coolie Royal, or you're just Coolie. Or if you, by appearance, look like you had a lot of Indian in you, you were just called Coolie, or you're called Indian, all right? So appearances really, really mattered. The texture of your hair, the length of your hair, to a certain extent, the color of your skin, which is, in a sense, hilarious as well, because you're fed with Bollywood and you only see the clearer skinned Indians, where a great majority of Indians who came to Jamaica were very dark skinned. They were from North India, but there were some from South India as well. Very dark complexion, comparable with maroon. We have a set of people called the maroons here. And if you look at folks out of Tamil Nadu, they look like us. All right, but we're fed this image of who an Indian should look like. And why I'm saying that is because the Jamaican Indian population is so small that we don't have all of the infrastructure or the foundation to help us along to maintain cultural ties. The numbers were too small to bring in pundits, too small to bring in imams. And so for celebrations such as Hosay became a celebration not just for Muslims, but also for Hindus or just for any Indian. My family, for example, came to Jamaica as Roman Catholic Indians, which made it even worse. There was nothing about Diwali, there was nothing about Eid there. It was Catholic, so their Indianness, quote unquote, which very much is connected to your religion, was lost along the way. I'm not saying that you can't be Roman Catholic and Indian. I'm simply saying that there are certain rituals that were lost simply because they were actually Roman Catholic. So embrace and just be glad that you or we are still in the Caribbean and we are allowed to celebrate all the parts that make us up. That's really what I wanted to say. Just celebrate who you are. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shani. Would any of our speakers like to comment? No, Suan? Applause, okay. Alia?
Yeah, applause as well. I think, for those who are not familiar with the term Dougla, because I see in the chat, etc., and also Dr. Mahabir had mentioned that in Fiji, the word Dougla is understood as a derogatory term. But that term Dougla, it actually comes from the Bhojpuri dialect to connote impurity, illegitimacy of this product of Indianness mixed with Blackness, right? Blackness, of course, being Africanness in the Caribbean context. And what does, Dougla, what did it denote in the Bhojpuri? Well, it meant bastard, mongrel, impure breed, right? Son of a dog, son of a whore. And, it spoke, of course, of Indian contempt for dark skin, for Blackness, particularly in the ways in which mixedness was considered to be threatening, especially to constructions of Indian purity. So I think it's important to understand, the denotation. And of course, today the connotation, has very much changed. But, for many Douglas that we spoke to, that denotation remains, alive and well, particularly in the ways that, They have been treated by family members, by members of their communities. And, this is why they have had to, in many ways, maneuver. And oftentimes, they maneuver to the default, right? And not to Indianness. I mean, Fern in the chat, Fern Luan Regis, who also wrote about Dougla, she mentioned in the chat that, for those persons who grew up in families where, for instance, the mothers were of Indian descent, they tend to exhibit more Indian linkages. So again, it's very subjective. Not all Douglas are very much the same. Not all will or can default, to Blackness, in this way. But it's important to know the denotation there. And again, possibly why there is this default to Africanness, to Blackness. But I did appreciate the comment before, and particularly, I think language is important. And again, how the ways in which Dougla is understood in different spaces, and how, mixed Afro-Indian persons, how they are described in spaces like Jamaica as well. And I think this is why, Nadine's experience is very, many of the Douglas, that we spoke to also had similar experiences, but the way that she was able to claim Indianness, that not many Douglas that we spoke to were able to very much, do so, right? So, yeah, I just wanted to make that point.
Great, thank you. Before we take our next question from Dr. Mohammed, Nadine, would you like to comment?
Yes, I would. I would say that because my Indianness comes from my maternal line, it was really significant. And because our village in Jamaica was concentrated with Indians, as a child, there was almost a year where we didn't go to school. My mum decided that our schooling and training would be in the bush, which is not conventional. My mother's not very conventional. And that's where we learned to, in those days, you didn't get flour without weevil. So we used to have to pick out the weevil. We used to then knead. We used to make the lawyers, bake the roti. We had a very traditional rural experience, and that was within the remnants of an Indian community. And then when we went back to England, my mother wasn't included within the broader African Jamaican community. She was included within the African Indian community. So my mother's friends were not African Caribbeans, they were African Indians. So I spent much of my childhood among African Indians. And so my Indianness was something that my mother wouldn't let anybody deny us of. So we used to go to an Indian dance troupe, and my sister and I were the two Black children. When we were performing for the mayor in London, we were the two Black children in the Indian dance troupe. So my mother didn't allow anybody to tell us who we were or that we didn't belong. But at the same time, she made us know we were not really Indian, because she gave us some hella African names that she pulled from some book, because she didn't want us to be confused, but this was the best that she could do for us. And so we just had a very strong sense of self, and my mother had a very strong sense of self, and that was something that she passed down to us. So even at times when it has been painful, particularly with Indians from India, who in my experience I found to be extremely racist, anti-Black, xenophobic, and everything in between, that wasn't my experience with Indians in the diaspora, because they had a different understanding of what being Indian was and what being mixed was. And they understood the value, which was that you don't get to choose, you get to negotiate. Or as Dr. Ranjit said, and Dr. Barrett said, you learn to survive and then thrive in your environments. And like all people, you use the skills and the tools that you have to do that. So my phenotype, when I'm around Africans from Africa, they think I'm from Ethiopia or Eritrea or Sudan. I'm an East African. And the most success I've had in my career is being in those places, because people think I'm one of them. But as Dr. Barrett said, it's not what you wear. You have to know who you are. And no full unmixed Indian can tell me that I am not any less Indian, because I have African ancestry as well. I'm so far removed in my identity that it can't move me. It can't move me. Those people are just, they're not ready yet. They haven't reached that level or stage of enlightenment. And it's the same as for Black people that will tell me I don't know myself and I don't know who I am if sometimes I wear a sari, or if I go to a traditional event and I have on a sari, and because I watch YouTube videos to learn how to wrap all the latest saris, that makes me any less Black or any less African, and I'm a sellout. I don't even talk to those people. They have no place in my existence. They're not enlightened enough. I am the future, and everybody like me is the future. And you're you're with us or you're not. You'll be left behind. Khalas.
I think your mic is off, Shalima. Okay.
Sorry, I was so engaged in what Nadine was saying, I didn't realize my mic was off. So thank you very much for sharing that. Let's call on Professor Patricia Mohammed now. Please unmute your mic. You need to unmute again. You're unmuted now.
Right. Thank you very much. Slower my hand. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to all the participants, panelists. There are two questions I have, and the first one is a philosophical take on the thing that you don't have to respond with my position on it at this point, perhaps. One is always saddened to hear narratives of racial abuse and pain. I mean, these stories recur so much that you think as we progress, they should get less. But they don't seem to. What they do, unfortunately, show the human capacity to create hierarchies from difference, and for the political leadership to exploit this fully, and our human frailty in accepting these imposed categories. And I wonder what we are afraid of, given that the survival of our species itself depends on genetic adaptation and mix. So having established that as a kind of premise, my question is whether any of those of you who have been dealing with this question have thought of or have looked at what is embedded in this retaining of purity of race and culture. What is at stake in retaining this? And once we've gone past the clutches of a colonial past, or will we ever go past that? There's a tendency to blame the colonial past, yes, but how can we go past this, and what is our agency in this? That's the first question. As I said, it comes out from a different position. And the second one is directly to Ms. Drummond. And I just wanted to find out what years were you and where were you located in the UK at that period? Because if you look at the 50s, there's another story going on then. And this is the first one I've actually heard about in terms of your particular kind of experience. So I just wondered about your location, the school and the area, and well, how old you were at that time. In that sense, what is the time period that we're speaking about? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what we'll do is take the second question first, because it was directed straight at Nadine. So Dr. Barrett and Dr. Ranjit Singh, please, we'll just ask you to take the first question second. Nadine, go ahead, please.
I was in London, South London, a place called Lewisham, which is a Jamaican stronghold. It was one of the places that Jamaicans were filtered to when they first went to the UK. And that's where my mum and dad went, and that's where they met. And my educational experiences happened in the 80s and the 90s. But these experiences, if there was to be any work done on people of Indian Caribbean descent during that period, wouldn't be that much different, because people didn't even know that Indian Caribbeans existed. There's a movement in the UK at the moment to tell the stories of the Indian Caribbeans that were on the Windrush when it docked, because their stories are being hidden or deemed not important. And so there are movements within people of Indian Caribbean descent in the UK to tell different types of stories about different types of Jamaicans, but also other types of Caribbean people. And the abuse that Indians from the continent or the subcontinent, I don't even like the subcontinent would have received is similar or the same as the abuse that Indians from the Caribbean would have received. But the difference is the Indians from the Caribbean would fight because the culture is different and the resistance is different. And often they would have, as long as they identified as Caribbean first, they would have the support of the larger kind of Afro or African Caribbean group. At least I would say my experience, because we were networked and interlinked with all of the other Indians from the Caribbean within our community, Lewisham.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Barrett, would you like to respond to the first question?
Sure, yes, and then I'll segue to Alia. Professor Mohammed, that's a very good question that you ask. You know, how do we move past this post-colonial inheritance? How do we decolonize in a way? To be honest, I would use the words of the Douglas that we spoke to, which is to being one's authentic self no matter what, in the sense that, yes, of course, we cannot escape, we cannot, deny our ancestry, our influences, our psyche. All of these things are very important to who we are and how we come to understand ourselves. But I think what was really special with our sample, our cohort over the years, was that they had claimed a newness for themselves, if I could use that word, and Alia can tell me if I'm reflecting them well there, in the sense that they kind of suggested, you know what, despite all of the current tensions, the past tensions, the ongoing tensions, the very negative responses to the very positive responses, the traumas we live with and the privileges we enjoy, we just claiming ourselves in our perfect nuanceness. I think Nicki Minaj said it best when people kept asking about her ethnicity, and she refused to racially account. She refused to be steeped in that post-colonial way ontology. She said, I'm just a bad bitch. I'm sorry if this is censored, but she just said that. She said, I'm just a bad bitch. To the sense that, why do you care? Appreciate my personhood, my justness. And as the Douglas say, I'm just Dougla. I'm complex, I'm complicated, and I exist. And either you appreciate it or you move along. So I think that's how we move away from it. We create our own newness of being. Alia?
I mean, I don't have much to add. I have no Nicki Minaj quotes. Indeed. But I really love that question, Professor Mohammed. What is at stake in retaining purity? I mean, I wrote it down. It's something I'm going to very much, consider. But I think Sue said it all, in terms of, the Dougla. The Dougla is just Dougla, right? The Dougla challenges purity, right? And, and it's just interesting the way that purity is still a discourse in the Caribbean, right? Given the legacies of colonialism. But yes, the Dougla challenges that, and the Dougla just wants to be Dougla.
Thank you, Alia. I see Dr. Mahabir wants to make a comment.
Yes, I just want to add that Trinidad and Tobago is perhaps the only country, maybe in the world, that has a separate category called Douglas in the population census. Other countries like Guyana, Suriname has mixed. And Dr. Rampasad did mention the 22% mixed, but mixed can be anybody, as Alia was pointing out, or Suan. But I think it's 8%, if I am to be corrected. 8%, it's Dougla population in Trinidad and Tobago from the last census. The other point I want to make is that all of what we are talking about and the whole Dougla phenomenon dynamics is a result of a colonialization, where we were socialized into thinking and believing that what is white is nice. You know, the ideal model, for instance, in these beauty pageants is someone, of course, there are exceptions, but it's someone who is tall, someone who is slim, someone with straight or relaxed hair, never kinky hair, or hardly, I should say, thin nose, narrow nose, thin lips, and so on. So these are the phenotypes that still pervade the society. And whether we like it or not, we still have that legacy. There's so many skin bleaching creams that people buy and hair relaxing stuff that they get. And there is the other aspect of this whole Dougla discussion that we have to look at, and that is the colorism. That you know, if you blacks stay back and so on, and even in the Indian community, even in the African community, the lighter skin you are, the more privileged you are, and the more superior these people feel, and they are treated differently from those who are black. And we can see that in the advertisements. Again, I study advertisements a lot, and you hardly see a fat black African woman, black skin, I mean, in the advertisements. It's somebody to be emulated. If it is, then it is for comical purposes. We had Beulah, for instance, who appeared in a few advertisements in the years gone by. So we are still living with these legacies. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. You all, we are at 5 p.m., 5:03 actually, but we cannot close today until we hear from Dr. Fern Luan Regis. She has written a book on Douglas, and remember too that the word Dougla existed in Bhojpuri because this miscegenation existed prior to. So Dr. Regis, please unmute your mic. Let's hear from you. Dr. Regis, are you able to speak now? We've had a number of messages from him on the chat.
Yes, I was unable to mute, so I had to wait till the permission was granted. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity.
Good afternoon.
Just following up on or commenting on some of the things that came out this evening's session. So I did not hear from Jamaica, but having seen her just now in the clip and her image, she said that she looked as peace, and that it just drew to me. What it drew to me is the connection that Fitzpatrice would have made when he did his study tour in India, where he posited that many of the Madrasis who might have come here on that part of Razak in 1845 might have themselves been Dougla. And that is just a useful point to note, because of course they would have come here. Some might have been labeled as Chamar, some as other kinds of low caste grades. But because of their skin texture and of course their port of entry might have simply been labeled Indian rather than Dougla. So the thing extends, you know, that Caribbean-ness. The beauty of Dougla, though, is that having been rebirthed into the Caribbean space, and having gone through so many semantic expansions in terms of the term. And Kumar pointed out something just now, Dr. Mahabir pointed out something just now, which is interesting because he referenced the census, and there's a extreme distinction between mixed and then, of course, mixed Afro-Indic. So he summed it at 8%. I think Alia pointed out that the exact figure is 7.7%. Of people who actually identify as Douglas. Now, it is curious that even in this identification, even in the larger acknowledgement that there is such a group, that the term itself used to identify this group is still seen as taboo. And it's just interesting. And as one last thing, just to point out, Dr. Barrett Suan talked about the distinction between Douglarization and the notion of Dougla identity being two separate things, and that's very, very real. But Douglarization has been dealt with on a number of levels as it relates to, not directly to the ways that Kumar suggested with respect to lines of voting, although, as he said, that it looks as though they vote PNM. That has not been my experience talking to particular Douglas either. But when we explore perhaps political calypsos and other kinds of songs coming out, whether it's from the direct Afric, as he labeled carnival, Afrocentric kind of traditions, or otherwise, you have I Would George Bottom in the Road, you have Fred Mitchell's composers dealing with Douglarization, which presents another side. So on one side, you have what some people term Indian subjectivity, because now you are relishing particular kinds of physical and sexual kinds of behaviors and traits that were perhaps once thought aligned to one specific ethnic group, but is now seen in others. That rarity, that objectivity, starting with Shorty, comes straight down. So you got a movement from looking at the Indians, at Indian women with that sense of awe. So you have things like Indrani, etc. And then moving to a Dougla kind of sensibility, a Dougla kind of a recognition of beauty, of mixedness, of best of both worlds, as in the work of perhaps David Rudder, right? He has Dougla, Spin Your Magic Over Me, and he speaks to that. And there's another song where he speaks to the actual challenge that Indic and Afric union creates in terms of family issues and those kinds of things, which still resonate very, very much today. So that is just something to a food for thought for people to go and look in. But back to very quickly to Fred Mitchell's statement, which is the mighty composer. His statement on Douglarization was what he claimed to be an African representation against such mixing. So it's not that you only had some kind of objection within the Indian camp, because persons still felt that it was Indian females being matched with with African or Afro males, but you also had the Afro male person objecting to those kinds of unions. So it's so rich, it's so complex, as Suan would have alluded to. 2 hours really is just a drop in the bucket to talk about things, because again, I have been jumping because so many fertile suggestions have come out of this meeting in terms of what people are interested in and the range of experiences. So yeah, and I think Professor Mohammed, the reality is the pain is still real. The minds of the people, we still have to go back, I think, genuinely to understanding Bob Marley's message in terms of humanity. Because the only way we can deal with colonialism is to understand what it has done to us as a people, and then see. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So we've had a very enlightening conversation, and I really want to commend Nadine Drummond, Dr. Suan Barrett, and Dr. Alia Ranjit Singh. Thanks very much to all of you for presenting and participating today. I also wanted to say thank you very much to Dr. Mahabir and all the speakers who would have added value to the discourse today with your comments and your questions. Unfortunately, we were unable to get Marlon Padachi's contribution from South Africa, but perhaps we will on another program. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring today's program to a close, and so I'll now hand you over to Shakira to formally close. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Shalama, and thank you all for taking the time to participate. Thank you especially to the speakers. As I've said before, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and the Amina Gafur Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. Please feel free to contact ICC if you have to publish your books and your reports. And remember that we are asking you kindly give us any of your suggestions, as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for details. Thank you to the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir. And thank you to our IT manager behind the scenes, Ravin Ramsingh, who has been recording the program and will edit and upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity. Our topic next Sunday will be Indians and Violent Crimes in the Indian Diaspora. So please like, share, and follow our Facebook page. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyabad.
Thank you all very much. We had a wonderful discussion, a lot of food for thought.